Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to the 2023 USC George Washington Leader Institute lecture. My name is Meg Nichols, and I am the 23rd Regent of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Since the ladies purchased Mount Vernon from the Washingtons in 1858, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has owned, operated, and preserved the home of America's first president to the highest standards, while also educating the world about the life, leadership, and legacy of George Washington. Before we get started, I would like to recognize and thank the Vice Regents that are joining us tonight. Ladies, thank you for all you do on behalf of Mount Vernon. And will you please stand for everyone to meet you. I would especially like to recognize our Vice Regent from California, Mary Beth Borthwick, along with her husband, Hal, who are here with us tonight. Mary Beth is a USC alum, and the Borthwicks' generous gift allows this important partnership between Mount Vernon and the University of Southern California to grow. Now in our 9th exciting year, this popular series, which we host in partnership with the University of Southern California's Sol Price School of Public Policy, explores George Washington's lifelong accomplishments, providing a better understanding of him as a man, as well as his remarkable leadership, professional achievements, and his long-lasting legacy. Please join me in a round of thanks for Mary Beth. I would also like to thank each of you for being here tonight and for your continued support of Mount Vernon throughout the year. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. David Sloan, who will bring greetings from the University of Southern California.
How are you? Looking forward to this. It's going to be fun. I'm confident. Good evening. I would like to thank Regent Nichols for her warm welcome and lovely introduction to tonight's conversation. I send greetings from my dean of the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California, Dana Goldman, who regrettably had to miss tonight's event due to a previous engagement. We at Price highly value the opportunity to partner with Mount Vernon. For 10 years, we have been fortunate to delve into George Washington's legacy through programs that have looked from Washington's view of the West to his pioneering ideas about farming, from his influence on the role of the president in the American government to his deft handling of foreign relations. We look forward to continuing to demonstrate the key leadership roles and principles he propounded. We can only wish tonight that we act with his wisdom in these tragic times with wars waged in the Ukraine and the Middle East. And we send our loves and hearts to the people who are undergoing the pain of those wars. I would be remiss if I did not mention my friend, Vice Regent Mary Beth Borthwick, and her wonderful husband, Hal, for their very generous gift to the University of Southern California that made this series possible. Now, please join me in welcoming the Washington Library relatively new Executive Director, Patrick Spiro. Previously, Dr. Spiro served as librarian and director of the Library and Museum of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, a library founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. Mount Vernon's only 270 years behind. The APS library holds 14 million pages of manuscripts, including those from Ben Franklin. We'll hear how many there are in their Library of Congress, I'm sure, from Dr. Hayden. Dr. Spiro earned his BA from James Madison University and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of several well-received books, A Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Early Pennsylvania, Frontier Rebels, The Fight for Independence in the American West, which won the Philadelphia Athenaeum's Literary Award. And was a finalist for the best book by the Journal of American Revolution. And his new book, which is forthcoming in 2024, Botany and Betrayal, Andre Michaud, Thomas Jefferson, and the Kentucky Conspiracy of 1793. Please welcome Patrick.
Thank you, David, and I'm thrilled to be here. I may be relatively new here, but I have been learning a lot about this partnership. And as I was preparing for this job, I went on YouTube and I started to see some of the programs that Mount Vernon had put on. And one of the first ones that came up are videos of these lectures over time. I remember seeing one on immigration, one on citizenship, and one on the West, and they're captivating videos. So I also want to thank the Vice Regent from California and Hal Borthwick for making this partnership happen, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it now. I also want to mention this is the 10th anniversary, not just of this partnership, but of the library itself. And coming up in a couple of weeks, we're organizing a major symposium on democracy. It's called The Great Experiment, Democracy, the Past, Present, and Future. And we've pulled together some of the leading thinkers in history, in politics, in journalism, in the courts, to come together in education to talk about the history of democracy in our country, but also its future. And so I encourage you all to check that out online and think about joining us in this conversation. It's November the 2nd to the 4th. And now it's my great honor to introduce our guest, Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress. And in so many ways, I feel like that's an introduction enough. But I thought I might talk about your career trajectory coming to the Library of Congress, because it's really quite remarkable. She began as a children's librarian for 6 years in Chicago, and then became the Youth Adult Services Coordinator for another 3 years. And then moving on to become the Library Services Coordinator at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And along the way, she also got her master's degree and PhD from the University of Chicago. From there, she went on to become a professor before becoming the chief librarian of the Chicago Public Library, and then moving on to the Enoch, I always get it wrong, Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore for 13 years, and becoming the first African-American woman to become named the Librarian of the Year in 1995. She is now the Librarian of Congress and has served in that role since 2016, nominated by President Obama. So welcome, Carla Hayden.
Patrick, as you were talking, I said, there's one person who would love to hear you go on, and that's my mom.
Yeah, she might be
not here.
in.
She's not here. So you can keep it short.
Okay. Great.
So, Carla, we decided that I would start.
Oh.
It's a little tight, isn't it? Let's give you a little more room.
Okay. Oh, a gentleman after my own heart. We're moving furniture.
I like
Oh,
room.
This could bode well.
So this is a series of lectures about the legacy of Washington's leadership. I can't imagine, and I'm sure, and I'm certain Patrick can't imagine anyone who is better to talk about this topic. So I want to do this by looking at 3 examples through your life where you were confronted with a serious issue that you needed to show great leadership. The first of these was, as a relatively young librarian, you found yourself director of one of America's historic libraries, the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. From what I've read, when you took over, it wasn't in, let's just say it wasn't in spectacular shape.
No.
And I wanted to have you talk a little bit about how did you meet those leadership challenges?
What was very interesting about going to Baltimore, Maryland, I knew it was 45 miles from Washington. I knew, though, about the Enoch Pratt Free Library because it was the first library system in the United States. So we studied it in library school. Mr. Enoch Pratt was a philanthropist and industrialist and said that the best thing he could give to the city would be a free library. And Andrew Carnegie came down to Baltimore to see how Mr. Pratt started this free library that was, as he said, free of politics and religion. They have an independent board, and it now is the State Library for Maryland. And so I knew about it from that part. And what I didn't know was the challenges that the city was going through at the time. And for so many people in that city, and it was all walks of life. When I would meet people, a senator or a person in the grocery store, they'd say, "Oh, you're the new library lady." And then they'd say,
Baltimore strikes me as that kind of
"It is
place.
that kind of town." And they would say, "The Pratt Library," and you could just fill in the blanks. I wouldn't have been able to be the state senator. Senator Mikulski actually grabbed me. Barbara Mikulski, if anybody knows Barbara Mikulski, she'll grab you. But everyone had a Pratt Library story. And so what the challenge was what would people 30, 40, 50 years from now say that the Pratt Library did for them? And that was the galvanizing part for me, to say we have to bring that back.
And so I read that you were out there sweeping the floors.
Well, that's why I like to move into furniture. I do have those tendencies. But I found a profession that allows you to be OCD and, like books and reading, so it worked out. I'm the child of two musicians, so this also was a good thing for me.
Yeah.
But yes, that was the part, because it was this grand, the Central Library was built 1931 on a department store model. So no grand steps, because as the director said at the time, we want ladies with prams and anyone to feel welcome. And it was a beautiful building. It had all these branches. And so it was just dusting off and saying, come on, we're going to do this. And the pride that the people in the city had was so evident.
And you really made it a different place, a
Yes.
place that was extraordinary.
I helped bring it back.
And then
And
you
that's-
confronted a real challenge in April of 2015,
Right.
when nearby Freddie Gray was arrested and never got to the police station alive. And there was, just like there was in many other cities during those periods, an extraordinary outburst. And reading about this, you're an African-American woman, head of this library, you're thinking about it, I'm sure, in many different, as an African-American woman, as the person who's responsible for that place, responsible for your employees, and you made what is an extraordinary decision.
And that was also a turning point in one way for me, because I believed in and working in Chicago, and that's why I left academia to get back into the fray of public libraries and things, but to know that when the branch library that was directly across from some drugstore that people saw on CNN and all these things, you saw it burning. The library was right across from it, with 2 stories of open windows. And we had put a mural on there that people had said, oh, they're going to deface the mural and everything. Well, they never did. The kids named it. It's a Pennsylvania Avenue branch. They named her Penny. They were children. And so the pride that it had. And also, it was the lifeline. And so the librarian that night, wonderful young
Michelle.
branch librarian,
Melanie
Townsend, who is now a director of a library system and everything, she called me and said and we knew that she had gotten, and we were on the phone, she'd gotten the staff out and the patrons that were there. And she said, Doc, they called me Doc, Dr. Hayden. Doc, we've got to open tomorrow because we are the only place that people can get online to apply for jobs, to do all this stuff. They're going to be waiting on us. And I said, okay, and I'll be there because that's the part about leadership. You don't ask people to do something you wouldn't do yourself. So I did that. I said, okay, I'm going to go. And I did something that a lot of you probably do if you're fortunate enough to have a mother who's still living. I waited until 5 minutes before I left to tell my mother that I was going down into the thing. And all she said, because she had changed from music to social work when we moved to Chicago, and she said, take paper towels and some water. You never know. And by 2 days later, she was sitting at the information desk with fresh fruit and some other things to give. And it became, though, and that there was a young man there that morning, 10 o'clock, who said, I'm so thankful you're open because I have to apply for a job because so many jobs now you have to apply online, he said. And the library was open. He could get on. And 2 days later, he came back and told us that he had gotten a...
So one of the things I loved about this story was the effect on other librarians. So apparently there's a very famous, a legendary photograph of you among librarians, of you pinning a piece of paper on the front door saying just simply, open.
We're open. And shortly before that, Ferguson, Missouri, I don't know if people remember, but there had been a similar incident. First, a young librarian who had only been on the job 1 month kept that library open. And it became the place where people could, just like in Baltimore, the only place that had restrooms. So the media was in there. They were filming. It was something. We said, oh, there goes so-and-so. But it was something. But it became the food distribution center. It became the opportunity center that it was. So that type of leadership, and what I have to also say that coming to Maryland, and that I also had to spend time in Annapolis, and I remember going to the state capitol in Annapolis and how proudly at that time the state comptroller, Louis Goldstein, took me around and showed me the room where Washington gave up his...
At the end of the war.
Yeah.
And so Patrick knows this a lot, but this period way better than I do as an historian, but it strikes me this is Washington. Right? Valley Forge, all the way through the war, he's there with the troops. He's not back in Britain like many of the British generals were. He's not back in Philadelphia. He's out there in the field. And it's the same kind of thing, that it is the lesson that I think any great leader can learn from Washington about being present. And we've heard it in this lecture series. We've heard it again and again, that leadership is about being there.
And don't forget about Martha, who joins all the winter encampments and makes a presence, her presence felt at those moments as well.
I got excited about the Martha because I just saw, you showed me in the library, the itinerary.
Yeah. And we have the account of all of Martha's visits to the winter encampments in our collection. So.
And she would bring provisions and things.
And she would help sew, she would be a presence around the troops along with other officers' wives and really help raise their morale in these deep, dark, cold winter months that could really, as Tom Page said, try men's souls. So.
Yeah.
And the library and the things that I saw just not long ago is just something, that they also had surplus food from the farm that they took.
Yeah, no, George Washington wrote a letter, because this also gets at his leadership. He realized that Mount Vernon was a symbol for the country. And even though he was fighting a war and far removed from his home, he realized that it was a symbol for the country. And what was the future going to be? And if he believed in the future, if he believed in the independent nation, it was important that Mount Vernon continued its operations as best as it could to symbolize his faith in the future and the cause. So.
For my third one, before I turn it over to Patrick, You're the first woman and the first African American to serve as Librarian of Congress. You're also, I believe, the third librarian
Since 1802.
since 18, yeah. Yeah, Librarian of Congress.
Well, yes. And the other two were the heads of the Boston Public Library and the Cleveland Public Library.
And so one of the things that struck me, I started going to the Library of Congress when I was doing my research for my dissertation in the 1970s. And it just opened my eyes to things that were unimaginable. In those days, you could actually go in the stacks, and I stood in front of this 12-foot stack I wrote my dissertation. Please don't hold it against me. I wrote my dissertation about the history of the American cemetery. And
It's okay.
this 12-foot stack was just every book I ever wanted to read.
On cemeteries.
And I sat there for 3 days, just read, because you couldn't take them out. So I just sat there and read, and it changed my life in some real way. But then it was a very conservative institution, and when you took it over, it hadn't changed that much. It was still a really conservative institution with all sorts of issues around your primary, it's called the Library of Congress for a reason, right? In our Congress, Library of our Congress.
Yes, they do.
And so how have you challenged the institution to join the 21st century?
Well, the institution was actually ready and primed. I think they just needed that push, and as a leader to say, it's okay. You can still maintain the scholarly reputation, all of that, and you can also inspire other people to, especially young people, because we're going to have an education center. We've already looked at yours, and also your shop.
Visit both.
We have, but you can inspire young scholars. And so one of the things that we did at first was to say, and get some of the senior curators and staff members together and say, what were the experiences when you were between the ages of 7 and 11 that led you to be the expert in, fill in the blank. And then the people started to talk. Well, my parents did this, or I had the opportunity to go to do this, or I did that. I visited Mount Vernon. I did this. And so that was the turning point, I think, to say, well, what can we do?
And you've done more than that, though. There's another just fantastic photo of you walking along with that little person next to you, right? I mean, you have pushed the Library of Congress to be outside the buildings, to actually think about who is inside. Is it old white guys like me, or is it everybody? Is it the accessibility that you've been pushing for forever?
When we have the cafe, you will go and take your coffee break, and you'll see a little person over there that's real excited because she or he got to see the world's largest collection of comic books. And they're just amazed. Or they got to see it as a little boy. Adam wrote me, because when I first became librarian, I was talking about opening up the treasure chest that is the Library of Congress and having everyone come in. And so Adam very nicely wrote a letter. He said, he was from California. He said, I'm 8 years old. I've heard you talk about this, but you can only get a reader's card when you're 16. And don't you trust young people? I haven't, he did that. We'll be careful. And I went around literally when I got that, because sometimes when you get a letter that it's on like no paper and it's not always good. Okay. You don't have that experience. But it was Adam. And I ran around and said, look, this is what it's about. And so now we're going to have an education center. It's targeted for that 7-Eleven so they could get the thrill of research. They've named it. It's going to be the source. We had a youth group, and so they can be history detectives, and that because that's where it really starts.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Library of Congress. If you've never been to the Library of Congress, you have to go. It has, the reading room alone is one of the most magnificent spaces in the entire world. And I actually study architecture. This is, I'm telling you the truth. It's just an amazing place. And then you get to get books that you can't get anyplace else, any place. And so it's an amazing place. But it was mostly for people like PhD students. It was for scholars
Well, it
in that
always
time. And I think it's
was.
amazing how you're trying to open it.
But and see, that's what was interesting when I got there. I said, you have this reputation, but you give a reader's card at 16. So it's an oxymoron there. Why are you, that's high school. And you're not in the exhibits and things. So that was part of what we were doing. But I have to say, and you saw how excited I got, talking about what you have in the library that's here now. It's truly remarkable. And we're going to be doing some joint programming,
Yeah,
the
it's
two
great.
Georges that are coming up, our George and George III.
There,
Why don't you
George.
tell them about that one?
Well, actually, people are here to hear you, not me.
No,
speak.
you're,
No,
I saw some of the materials you're going to loan.
No, there's a fantastic exhibition that's being co-curated by the Library of Congress and the Science History Museum in the United Kingdom, which has a lot of George III's scientific material. George III was interested in agricultural innovation, much like George Washington, and it's really interesting to think about how much they disagreed on certain areas, but also how they were reading and practicing very similar things at the same time in part of this Enlightenment project.
And the same books. So I recognize the book on husbandry that you have in the library here, and it's the same book that George III was reading at the same time. So that's what it's going to be, that they were both interested in all of these things. And so a lot of the materials that I saw just an hour ago are going to be in the exhibit.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things that we're able, so we do this here in the fall, and then we do it at USC in the spring. And last spring, we had Michael Pollan
Oh,
come and talk about agriculture and talk about Washington's pioneering ideas about agriculture. And it was fascinating because Michael Pollan's a really, really smart guy. And he looked at me and said, I didn't know any of this. And I think it's one of the things that the library is doing better and better to help us understand the full meaning of George Washington as a leader, not just politically, not just militarily, but in so many other ways.
and the one article that really touched me was the reproduction of, well, it's original.
Yeah.
From, it was written by Richard Allen, and he was the founder of the African American Methodist AME Church, and it was a eulogy, and he had a line in there.
Yeah, and he talks about Washington's decision to free his slaves in his will and says that this is the one stain that could have brought him reproachment, but he tried to wipe it away before he died. Unfortunately, that eulogy was not as widely disseminated as I believe Washington had wished this would be his last final public act. So Dr. Hayden, I was, when I was reading your biography, so I'm glad I read your biography because I realized something. You're celebrating your 50th anniversary this year. You began as a librarian in 1973. So I think that's a...
I hadn't thought about it like that. You know, as you mature, these anniversaries sneak up on you. I hadn't thought about that. I was still recovering from the birthday. Yeah. So now we have this.
Yeah.
All righty.
But so you began as a
Children's librarian.
in Chicago.
Accidental librarian. That's what I was. I mentioned that I'm the child of two classically trained musicians. By 12, we all agreed I had no talent. And it was okay. And they were very, very supportive of that. You know, it was like, okay, you gave your last recital, cleared the loom, we're done. It's over. But what I realized that text, I could read text and I hear voices, and they could look at manuscripts and notes and hear music. And they supported that. So I always loved books and reading. And I majored undergrad in political science and history. And, that sometimes leads to becoming a lawyer.
Sometimes.
And after sometimes. So while I was contemplating that, my dear brother said, while you're thinking, how about a little employment? And so I would go between job interviews where they told me, you're a nice young lady, you had good grades, you have no work experience. And I would go to my favorite place, the Chicago Public Library, Central Library, between. And then a colleague that had just graduated with me saw me there and said, hey, Carla, you're here for the library jobs. They're hiring anybody. I said, what? He said, yeah, anybody with a, undergraduate degree. And we still do that in libraries. That's how we hook people, we introduce them. And so I went upstairs, I applied, got it, and they put me on the south side of Chicago in a storefront library with a young lady who was going to graduate library school, University of Chicago, but she was giving a story time with autistic children in the 70s with jeans on and everything. And I said, this is something different. This is not what I thought. And then that's when I went and applied. And this part, Dean Peggy Sullivan at University of Chicago. So I go to apply to graduate library school thinking, how hard could this be? I was thinking about law, what. So I go. And I had the interview, and she said, well, I don't think you have what it takes. What? Libraries. I mean, really, we laugh about it now. Or she's just passed recently, actually. We would laugh. And I went away, and I was really upset. And then I went back and told her, well, I think I could be a good librarian. I want to help people. Information is power and everything. She said, that's what I wanted to see. That's what I wanted to see.
So now when you think back on those 50 years, there's been so many transformations
In
to the
libraries.
library. Yeah. Is there anything that's been lost along the way that you wish was still a part of libraries?
Not the card catalog.
No, see, that's the thing. I do miss that.
People don't realize the card catalog was never pure.
Yeah.
People would take the cards. Yeah. And I think there are a few people in this audience that used to do that when they were in college. They would take the cards.
Come on, admit it. Come on.
You know you did.
Let's see some hands.
You know you did. Okay, so it was never that pure thing. Now you really got me excited. The card catalog, because the first book I did for the Library of Congress was the card catalog book about that. So there were, when you think about what we missed, I think we haven't, I wouldn't say I think we've gained. I think technology has helped us reach more people, be more relevant. We can digitize things that people who could never travel here or could never travel to the Library of Congress can actually see, magnify in that. So we've expanded our reach, I think.
Yeah, that's great. This is another anniversary. It's the 10th anniversary of this library. So I also want to ask you a hypothetical question. If 10 years ago, as everybody was talking about whether or not there is a reason to have libraries anymore with the advent of technology, and somebody came to you and said, there's this group that's trying to build this massive library dedicated to George Washington, what would you have said?
Great. Because with presidential libraries, as you know, FDR, they did put in Herbert Hoover's later, but that's the start of presidential libraries. But that also is in Hyde Park, and then you have Valkill, that's there. And then the other ones. The idea of having the library here with the actual house, with the places that he walked and lived, gives researchers, I would imagine, a different experience. And the fact that in 10 years, and we are a little jealous of this, I've asked you for the list, 50 books have been written in 10 years by people using this library.
That's remarkable.
Remarkable. And the different subjects that they've carried. So think about it. They can walk from the library, come up, see what Washington saw, see those things. Gives a depth and breadth to, I would think, the experience. So having a library right here and being able to see something that I think back to Martha, what you showed me there, because I've seen the exhibit here that, to be honest, as a librarian and someone in archival work, when I see that recreation of Martha Washington burning the letters, you could imagine. Like, oh, Martha. But she was thinking of personal. But what did you show me?
We showed one of the 3 last surviving letters, George Washington to Martha Washington, written just after Washington is appointed commander-in-chief in 1775. And in it, he had arrived in Philadelphia, assuming he'd come back to Mount Vernon, but now realizing that his future was uncertain, and he may never visit Mount Vernon again and see Martha. And he says, I retain an unalterable affection for you, which neither time nor distance can change. And that was one of the few letters she saved and was found rolled up in the back of her desk after she died.
Because she couldn't part with it. And see, that's what humanizes people in history, that you see that and you know that. So it gives you a feeling when you then see the exhibit, and then you know, and you can go to the library and see that this is the only thing that he saved. So having a library right here on the site is remarkable. So I applaud you for this, because it really deepens the experience. And you're going to have 50 more books.
Oh, yeah. We have over 40 fellows coming from around the globe every year here, conducting original research, making new discoveries about the past that helps us think differently about who we are, where we've been, and where we might go. It's remarkable.
There's history, there's hope in history, is what we say. Yeah. So when you look back, there have been hard times before. We've made it before. We've had things. I remember the exhibit about slavery here at Mount Vernon that was just remarkable. Dealing with history honestly and looking at it so that we have hope for the future.
So now I have a self-interested question. If you were in charge...
We're not giving the papers back.
Oh. I asked about that earlier.
We're not. We have the papers of 23 presidents from George Washington to Coolidge.
But we're so close. It'd be so close.
I know. We
You
can
could just
loan
them to us.
We can loan.
Yeah.
Loan.
Oh, good. Well, we could talk about a loan then. I feel like the door's open a little bit now.
It's open.
But I have a different self-interested question. If you were in charge of a library that was only 10 years old, didn't have any of the legacies that so many libraries have, what are some things that you would do? And just as importantly, what are some things you would not do?
I got a chance to see, it's almost wonderful the way you have the division of the more general books about everything, including the Chicago Manual of Style. I was very impressed. I said, whoa, that's something. Yeah, that right there. I would invest in what's unique, not the popular things or the things that you can get in any library, really, any university library, any public library, especially the big ones. But those unique Marthas, that letter, the rare, the things, that's what scholars want to see, the things in his own hand. Those are the things that would make this unique, because then you can see even the desk that he might have written the letter on when you visit the house.
Do you find that the congressional members that come to the library want to see that kind of thing?
Yes, and I know I know that because we have and we host things, and we're very blessed that a young man that had association here, Mr. Butterfield, is now with the Library of Congress at the Kluge Center that serves Congress. And yes, they are very interested, and sometimes we are that safe place for them. Because we're nonpartisan. We still serve Congress. We have a Congressional Research Service. They are the research arm of Congress, and so they do that. But we also have authors and programs for them, and we bring out materials based on what we have in the collection. At Pearl Harbor, we have the original telegram that said, "This is not a test," and that. So we bring that, and it gives them a sense. We bring out things about George Washington or leaders and all that. And it gives them an opportunity to think about the fact that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, someone might be writing about them. Yep. And that this is part of a journey for this country. And it's very heartening, and I think most people would be heartened when you see some of the members of Congress who are really interested in history and learning from history.
That's great. I have one last question before we maybe turn it over, and it was on leadership. When I heard David asking you about leadership, do you think there are unique, being a library leader, is there unique skills that you need that maybe other sectors don't need? And are there things that you've learned as a leader in a library that you would like the business world or the military or something to adopt?
You learn from leadership, and there's a wonderful book, Leadership on the Line. So leadership is its own area of study, of endeavor. And you can learn from leaders in all sectors, from business. Military is very good because their mission, so you learn about leadership and what some of the tactics. There are also subgroups, women in leadership, you do that. And when I started getting into management and leadership, I read everything I could on leadership. And so one was in the museum world, too. Thomas Hoving, Making the Mummies Dance, when he took the Met and started doing that. So leadership is something that transcends what you're leading. You can lead young people, and there are now workshops on leading from any position. You can lead up. You can be the person that helps that.
Yeah, that's great. So we have an online question that I think is really interesting. It's actually 3 questions. I'll ask the first one, I think, but because it's one I think about all the time. Do you still get to read for pleasure?
Yes. Sometimes, not as much. And I have aspirational books. Those always have to do with exercise and diet. There are things that you have to read for work. There's a lot going on about justice and equity in search engines and things like that, and that. So there's a lot going on there. I love mysteries. And so
You
there's
read now?
Louise. Well, we're going to have a mystery night at the library in a couple of weeks, and Louise Penny is going to be there, so I have to read the thing. I'm interviewing her.
She's good.
But
I'm a mystery reader, too.
yeah,
So.
so she's good. I haven't read her before, so I got started. Josephine Tay. Remember?
Also
Yes,
excellent.
from years ago, my aunt.
Years ago.
Yeah, that's how I got started. So that's the kind of thing. And then biographies. I love biographies.
So when I mention the name Washington, what comes to mind?
The leadership, what really comes to mind is going and seeing where he put down his, right in Annapolis.
Yeah.
And would not become king. He did it. And also now when I see his copy of the Constitution where he made notes on what a president should be
Yeah.
and do in his own hand.
Which we also have here.
No, that's yours.
Yeah.
That we want.
Well, there's loaning. We can figure something out.
But he was when you think about Washington and the reason why he still resonates, it's not just because it was because he was the first and he shaped it, but he modeled it.
Yeah.
And to have that testimony from Richard Allen saying the only thing that could stain his possibly in posterity is that, and that he was working to remove that stain.
Another online question was just, what is the process for choosing the U.S. Poet Laureate? And I might add to that, how do you think about making awards? Because that's also a form of leadership, I think.
And it's been a wonderful part of being the Librarian of Congress because there's the Gershwin Award for Popular Songs, so that's actually a lot of fun, who has but the Poet Laureate, when you think about Carl Sandburg and all of the Poet Laureates, so how do you pick, and there's a advisory committee of poets, prior laureates as well that suggests names, but to think about what would be a poet for the time. And right now, the poet who just got a MacArthur Genius Grant, Ada Limon, first Latina woman, is also doing a poem that's going to go up on the Europa satellite for NASA.
Yeah.
And so she concentrates on nature, connecting with nature, and thinking about how we relate to the planet. And so I thought, right now, this would be really good.
Before we go, could I sneak
Go
one
ahead.
in?
Yeah.
I read a bunch of stuff about you, and no, it was great. It was really great. If you want to read about her, there's a beautiful article about her from the University of Chicago magazine.
Well, they're a little prejudiced.
She's an alum. People do that, I know. And so, but it's really nice. But one of the things in everything is how you view libraries as anchors. Now, I think of that as parenthetic community
Yes.
anchors.
Yes.
But I was wondering, what do you mean by that? Why do you use it so often? And is it just community anchors, or is it multiple kinds of anchors?
It's multiple. When this country, right after the Civil Wars, when with public education, it was also the start of public library movement, and communities realizing that having that one place that is free and open to anyone. Let the books, we used to say, let the books battle it out on the shelves. We're equal opportunity offenders. but you have the right to know. And that a growing country and a country needs that, as one person said, it's an opportunity center for people who never think about the people who couldn't afford to have World Book encyclopedias, but they could go to the public library. August Wilson, the playwright, got a degree the first ever degree from the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh because he dropped out of high school and went every day to the Carnegie Library. And the librarians knew he was, he got that. So their places, trusted sources for health information. I remember being in Chicago in one of my first reference, when they let me on the reference desk. My first thing, a lady came in and she had just been to the clinic and she had her prescription and she wanted to know what it was. And so we looked in back then you had to look in that book and find out.
Yeah.
So it's stability, it's a place for everyone to go. And it's had its moments in the Jim Crow South. There are a lot of books about that, and that's when being denied access to libraries was part of. There's a memorial in front of the Jackson, Mississippi Public Library to the Tougaloo Nine, Tougaloo College, a historically black college. And you hear about a lot of the freedom riders, or these are freedom readers. And they use library skills because back in that day, and this happened even in Baltimore, there were restricted places. They were called colored branches. So you didn't go to the central library. So these young students looked at the card and the way that people got rebuffed sometimes was like, well, you get it from your branch, your black branch or whatever. And they checked the card catalog, and they made sure that the books that they were going to request were not in the colored branch. So they had, I love that, because they used library skills to do that, and the people had to say, yeah, this is the only place where these books are available.
Future librarians.
Yeah. But that symbol
Yes.
of knowledge, and so in terms of me being the first woman, of course, librarianship is one of the 4 feminized professions where 85 to 90% of the profession is female. Top management does not reflect that. So being the first woman is significant, but also being the first person of color to head the world's largest library when people that looked like me were punished by whips, amputations, fingers, all of that was personally.
I'm going to sneak in another. I'm sorry, I can't resist. Does the Library of Congress look at its history
Yes.
of racism?
Well, what's interesting in terms of racism, and what it is. So yes, there have been suits because it is still part of it's the federal government and in Washington, D.C., and the federal system. So there have been challenges. What's also interesting, too, though, the Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet, when the Thomas Jefferson Building opened in 1897, he was working at the Library of Congress and had helped move the books over there. And the famous line, I know why the caged bird sings, in the new biography of Paul Laurence Dunbar, it's verified that he was talking about the stacks of the Library of Congress, and he was the caged bird, and it's the poem called Sympathy. So there have been instances, and we're still working on making sure that the collections reflect everyone, and that's been part of it. So diversity is part of what we're making sure that we do.
Well, I now have a question that you've probably never received before, and it's very different from the conversation we're just having. But there's a question following up on what you said about the card catalog. Why do you think people
love
would,
the card catalog?
Why would people steal cards out of a card catalog?
Well, okay, and I have relatives that have admitted doing this. Well, think about it. In the 40s and 50s and even before, that was your only access point to finding the books on the shelves. And people would just pull it out and take it to the shelf. And, oh, there's some nodding heads here. Yes, they would.
Yeah.
That's how and then they would just throw it, because I remember my first library job was putting the cards in the catalog.
Wow.
And that's when you could see what's missing and stuff. Plus, I always wondered, I'm a poor speller, so I thought, boy, people don't even know that some of these cards are not in the right order anyway.
Yeah. So there's actually another question I wanted to ask, and we probably have the time. And when you were responding to David, I mean, I was thinking about all the different roles that a library serves and has served. You're talking about in Baltimore needing people to apply online. A lot of people think about libraries as books. So I was wondering, do you think the fundamental definition or role of a library has changed over those 50 years in which you've been in the profession, or is it always?
No, it's still the same. It's still to give information, entertainment, whatever. And what's changed is the container. So for a long time, and they're wonderful, and you've probably seen some of the books of the history. Alberto Manguel has a wonderful history of reading, where, librarians, that's why we have that reputation, because we're protecting the book, because that's sometimes the only copy, and that was the fines and all of that. So we were very in the library profession for years, because that was the main container. Once technology came and the information and the ideas were freed from the container, then that was different. But what remains is still the original documents, the things that you can see. Those are the unique things.
Yeah. Another question, what is the Library of Congress's relationship to the National Archives? And can you say a little bit more about its relationship to Congress as well?
And the Smithsonian, too,
yeah.
because we're like in Washington, as you know, they have gangs, like Gang of 8, so we're the Gang of 3. The National Archives, Library of Congress, and the Smithsonian. When FDR and they started the National Archives and Records for the government, that's when the separation happened. So the Library of Congress before that, actually had the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and everything.
So
and
you gave that
wonderful there's a wonderful photo of tanks coming up the steps to get it. It was all staged, we found out later, to retrieve them, to take them to the archives. So now the division is official documents relating to government, the departments and things in the presidential libraries are NARA, they call it. And we get things like the diaries, the letters. We have 38 Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Madeleine Albright. We have all kinds of people, but it's their personal correspondence and not.
Do you ever worry about having too much and
No.
making it difficult to access?
No, because when you think about on the long term, The Library of Congress has 3 buildings in Capitol Hill. Thomas Jefferson Building, 1897, the first federal building to have electricity. That's why it's so beautiful with the
love
globes
that,
and things,
yeah.
because they were so proud.
Yeah.
They outgrew that, and then they had to build the John Adams Building, 1939, right by the Folger Shakespeare Library, same thing. And then they outgrew that in 1980, the James Madison Building. And then there are storage units in Fort Meade, Maryland, and Culpeper, Virginia, with the sound recordings and things like that, and 6 overseas offices that collect materials from around the world based on Thomas Jefferson's library, that there's no subject to which a member of Congress should not have occasion to refer. And so we collect in 470 languages, and half of the collection is in languages other than English. And so in the projections, we're building more of those storage units, but in about 50, 100 or so years, you're not going to get as much physical material.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to get it now.
You're great. You answered the next question, which was, what does the Culpeper location specialize in?
Oh, film. Disney, we have the original nitrate films from major studios in court. And Disney is one of our favorites because they have a full-time archivist. Disney has right there. So you can see the first Mickey and all that. Also photography, Dorothea Lange, Gordon Parks, those types of things, and sound recordings. We just had a program with Bill Moyer. He's giving his archive, so we have an archive of American public broadcasting as well. And then one is a Chicago person, Studs Terkel, his archive. So you have the sound recording, you have the film and image.
Yeah. So 2 questions on the same topic. And that is, in a changing world in which we have a fragmented media and social media that really creates individualized experiences for people, what role, if any, does the Library of Congress play as a source to combat misinformation or for providing clear guides on good information and facts?
And this library, here, you can see in George Washington's own hand what he thought about being a president. You can see the real thing. He also engaged in a little misinformation.
Yeah.
You have to tell this one. I have.
So, I'm a historian, so I can go on for too long. I will try and make this as brief as possible. We have this incredible proclamation signed by Lafayette, who is a close friend of Washington, as you know, and an adopted son. Lafayette and Washington hatched this plan that they were going to create a false attack on Canada, to try and convince the British in New York City that the French were going to invade Canada. And Lafayette printed all these proclamations, 500 of them, to circulate around New York City with the idea that the British officers would receive them and send the troops up the Hudson River Valley and creating an opening for Washington. And what's even more remarkable about this is this proclamation, the manuscript of it, was sent to Benedict Arnold in Philadelphia, who at that point had turned to the British, and Washington and Lafayette accomplished their goal, but not the way they meant to.
So some things aren't that new.
Yeah. So last question, and it's related to one of these, but
No,
it's
I
a
have
little
one.
different. Oh, okay. Second to last question.
It's a quick one.
I'd love to have taken a class with you. I can tell.
Yeah. So working in this hyper-partisan world, how do you feel? And how do you navigate
That
it?
what we are providing for Congress and for the people it serves, we are that safe place. They come, they see it, and I take every opportunity I can, and my colleague, Nicole, is here with me, to say, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, this is what libraries do in your district, in your state. So you are getting the same type of thing that we provide, unbiased, an opportunity, a refuge, a place to get information. And so they really embrace that, and we are that place for them. And it's heartening to see.
So I want to take you back to the beginning. So when I was a young man, we had the East Colvin Library. And I was one of 3 boys. Then my sister, who's here, came. And my mom would do one thing with each of us. And my thing was, we're going to go to the library. And I could take out as many books as I could read in a week. And then we went and got eclairs as a gift. Yeah, definitely good. But that just, that set the structure of my life to become a scholar. At some really, my mother, when I got my PhD, she looked at me and said, I knew at 6 you were going to be an historian.
That's right.
What about you? When was that? You didn't come to libraries
No.
naturally. But what is that early
Well, I did
thing?
it was reading and books that came naturally. So I would spend summers. Well, my mom was a reader. My dad, made violin and stuff, but he read. But my mom was a reader and loved that. And then my grandmother would spend summers in Springfield, Illinois with my grandmother. And she loved Nora Lofts and all this stuff. And she would read to me and Hans Christian Andersen and all of this. So I couldn't wait to learn to figure out how to make that magic come out of those markings. So that was it. And so then the books. And then the first time when we moved, my dad got the jazz bug. So we moved to New York. And the first little storefront library, and I go there after school. That was my treat. And then I don't remember who put this book in my hand, Bright April. And I loved you've heard me talk about it, because it was the first time I saw myself in a book. I love books and read, but I never seen anybody that looked like me. And she was about 8. She was a brownie. She had 2 pigtails. She was brown. They had a piano in the living room. The same thing, the rug. I thought I was Bright April. That's where I learned about library fines. Because I took it out over and over, because books are supposed to be windows to the world, but also mirrors. And if we think that reading is so important, if you don't see yourself in a book, that's also a signal. So that's, so libraries have always been, because it was like, wow, look at all these books. And I could just take them.
I was telling you earlier, I looked at that big stack and went, this is my place. And there's me. Will you join me and Patrick in thanking Dr. Hayden?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.